Well, Dhruv, you have heard Kallol. You might like to respond to some of his provocative comments, and then I'll ask some other questions.
I mean, there's a lot to say, there's a lot to analyze about this visit. It was very much anticipated. It was can you hear me now? Is that better? Yeah. Okay. This was a very interesting and important visit. It was very much anticipated. There was wall-to-wall coverage, certainly in India. And I think we need to put it in a little bit of context. For one thing, I think I seem to have read a very different joint statement from what my co-panelist seems to have read. Because what I saw was really a strategic partnership, however you define it. India managed to get the strongest statement ever from the United States on Pakistan's state support for terrorism. It managed to get the strongest statement to date from the United States on issues of connectivity, which are now a vital concern for India and an existential issue for India. We got the strongest commitment to date on cooperation on the Indo-Pacific, and the very use of that terminology by the United States is, as was mentioned earlier, significant. So on three areas which are of significant strategic import for India, we've got the strongest statement to date from the US government. I think this really needs to sink in to people. I don't know what it would take to have a definition of a stronger strategic partnership. Beyond anything stronger than that, I think would be things that we in India would be uncomfortable with. Would be exactly the kinds of things that the Hindu would be writing, excoriating criticism about. We're getting too close to America. So I'm not really quite sure whether the problem with the US is that it's too close, it is too overbearing, or is it that we can't trust it? It has its own agenda. I think a few elements we need to break this down a little bit. What do we want when we want a strategic partnership? We really want three things. We want we want assistance in our own capacity building. We want India to be a stronger power, and we want the rest of the world to help us. The US could play that role. The US does play some of that role. Others do as well. Europe does, Japan does, Russia does, China does, even China. Secondly, we want interoperability. We want the ability to work with other partners when it is in our convergent interest. This is not a binding alliance, and anybody who says that we're entering into a binding alliance is raising a straw man. We want options, and there are contingencies where those options may be required. The Malabar exercises are at the forefront of this. There's a lot of other things are going on. Equipment is part of the story. It's not all of the story, and I think on the US side there's a tendency to stress the equipment as a necessary element of interoperability. A third is a third element of a strategic partnership involves sharing information. That is being candid with each other, not just in the realm of intelligence, that's one element of it, but also political consultations. And it also means being frank about our differences. India and the US do have differences. We have differences about Pakistan, we have differences about Russia, we have differences about Iran. And I think as two friendly countries, we need to be honest with each other. So I think those are the three integral elements to any strategic partnerships between two countries today: interoperability, capacity building, and information sharing. And on all three of these fronts, I think we have seen steady progress, not just in the last few months, not just in the last few weeks, but even before that. I want to briefly address, well, perhaps we can leave that for the Q&A, but on some of the issues of the Indo-Pacific, I think we can go into a bit more detail.
Well, Dhruv, if you read the statement when President Obama came in January 2015, mm-hmm. US-India joint vision, and you read this one. Many people say deja vu, you find most of things are mentioned there. Now we all know that President Trump has tremendous dislike for phrases like Asia pivot, US-Asia rebalance, TPP already dumped. So do you think he's going to let China dominate this region? Or in spite of all his dislike for whatever Obama was trying to do, he will not leave this region to be dominated by the Middle Kingdom?
You know, it's very interesting watching the US-India relationship for the last year or so, from the campaign when Trump's rise within the Republican Party, the campaign with Hillary Clinton, his victory, the whole transition. We've seen the media narrative, particularly in India, wildly oscillate. On the one hand, you had people saying Trump will be good for India, and it wasn't really based on a lot of substance. It was a stray statement here or there. At the same time, after he was elected, and initially, I kept on saying that India was relatively well placed compared to the rest of the world when, in terms of dealing with the Trump administration. India wasn't dependent on the United States for alliance guarantees. We didn't have a major trade deal hanging in the balance like Japan and other TPP countries. And in fact, thanks to the good work of Ambassador Arun Singh and others, the Indian government have been quite good about reaching out to members of the Trump campaign when many other countries did not. That being said, after Trump was elected, people thought that we were in a lull. There seemed to be no movement. Apparently, people thought India was being ignored. I actually had a journalist ask me a few days before Modi went whether this was the worst point of time in India-US relations in history, which I thought was slightly hyperbolic. But I think we need to look at, provide some, just some context for this. In terms of China, and by the way, a lot of that was because of what was seen as very aggressive outreach by China. In terms of Xi Jinping's visit to Mar-a-Lago, in terms of the outreach to some of Trump's associates, including his family. At the same time, we've now seen, just in the last 2 weeks, it wildly oscillate in another direction. Suddenly people are talking about greater tensions between the US and China in the context of the North Korea crisis, in the context of the South China Sea. In a paper, I laid out 5 broad scenarios for US-China relations, and I don't think it's settled, even within Washington today, which of these will pan out. At various points, some will seem more plausible than others. The first one, and possibly the one that is of greatest comfort for us in India, would be a militarized pivot to Asia, without the language of the pivot to Asia. This is something that some of Trump's advisors had written. Alexander Gray and Peter Navarro, who's now one of his economic advisors, had written an article in which they basically said that this would be his Asia policy. This would not be a bad thing from India's point of view. A second, and another thing that some of Trump's advisors have pointed to is a deliberate policy of unpredictability. And this would be something that would keep both adversaries and potential partners guessing. And that might be the best way forward in the region. A third possibility, and one that I think is less, we would look at it in a less sanguine manner from New Delhi's point of view, is a deal. President Trump is a self-proclaimed deal maker. Perhaps he's just staking out a negotiating position that would allow a deal with Beijing. And who knows what would be the bargaining chips in that, perhaps some Indian interests. A fourth possibility is one where the US adopts a very belligerent posture but isn't able to back it up, or doesn't have the will or political will to back it up. And that could be seen as quite provocative and yet destabilizing at the same time. And finally, a trade and currency war. I think that still remains a possibility. And the more President Trump talks about trade in the context of China, that possibility remains alive. So I think we need to plan for all of these scenarios. Some may be more likely than others in the near future, and all of them may be scenarios to keep in mind even after transitions in government in both Beijing and Washington.
Let me ask one more question before I pass on to Jorawa. In this joint statement, while talking about regional connectivity, there are several sentences which, as Jeff said, refer to OVOR or BRI. Now, those lines, do you think Indian position vindicated India's reservations about not attending the launch of BRI, and what has been said there comes closer to our doubts? What is your view on
that? It's quite interesting. When India decided to boycott the Belt and Road Forum in May of this year, there was a lot of analysis, certainly in China, and to some extent in India and in third countries, that India was unnecessarily isolating itself. and that India would pay consequences, certainly, possibly economic, possibly political. The fact is, India laid out a marker, and it's quite interesting to see the criteria that India used. India said, the Indian statement said that it was not, there was no opposition to investment in infrastructure, there was no opposition to connectivity, and instead, all such projects must respect countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity. They must be sustainable in terms of financing. They must have transparent cost assessments associated with them. And they must be accompanied by the transfer of technology or knowledge to local communities to make these projects sustainable. And they must take into account environmental and ecological factors. And these were a set of criteria that were laid out by the Indian government quite clearly. It's quite interesting because subsequently and very soon after that, several European countries articulated, I think independently, not because of India, articulated very similar concerns about the Belt and Road Initiative, as did Japan. And now, in this joint statement with the US, we actually see the US, at least in principle, signing up to some of the same concerns. The US clearly has long had concerns about the Maritime Silk Road. At least that element of the Belt and Road Initiative. And the reason we're seeing such an emphasis on Indian Ocean cooperation is a direct outcome of that. On the question of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is the other element with which India has problems, the views in Washington still remain split. There are signs that some in the military establishment certainly have concerns about, for certain, the port at Gwadar. There are hints that they even have some concerns about the project in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and Balochistan, although that has been less articulated. However, many civilian leaders in the US who believe that the project might actually help strengthen Pakistan and make it less of a concern from the United States point of view, don't seem to share India's concerns. And so I think we'll still need to navigate a little bit some differences in perception on the China-Pakistan economic corridor going forward. But that being said, this was a very welcome step on the part of the Trump administration.
Thank you, Dhruv.